Hi everyone, welcome to episode 62 of the Startup Playbook podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. Before we get into this episode, on Wednesday, the 23rd of August, I'll be hosting a live podcast interview with Kate Morris, the founder and CEO of Adore Beauty. Adore Beauty is Australia's first online beauty and cosmetics e-commerce store, which was launched in Kate's garage in Melbourne with just $12,000 and two little-known cosmetic brands on board. Fast forward 18 years later, and Adore Beauty has grown to more than 190 brands, 13,000 products, and an annual turnover of $28 million. At the event, Kate will be sharing her incredible story of overcoming the initial years of struggle and the challenges that came with scaling and growing the company to the size it is today. If you're interested in attending the event, head to playbookkatemorris.eventbrite.com. I'll also include the link for the event in this episode's show notes, which will be available at startupplaybook.co. So, for episode 62, my guest is Robert Wickham. Robert has had an extremely interesting career to date. He studied aeronautical engineering at MIT before taking up a role within management consulting at the Boston Consulting Group. He then left that line of work to take up an audacious project of launching a low-cost European airline within 6 months. This project was called GoFly, which was later sold in 2001 for $400 million. He has since taken on senior roles at organizations such as Oracle before taking on his current role as the Regional Vice President for Innovation and Digital Transformation at Salesforce. In this interview, we talk about the ingredients of good storytelling, how to hire for resilience, creating a culture of innovation, and the need to have an ecosystem strategy. Without further ado, here is my interview with Robert Wickham. Hi, Robert. Welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Hi, Rohit. I'm a big fan of the podcast. Delighted to be on the show here with you today.
Thank you. So for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Sure. So my story began in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, where I was born, and lived there for the first 18 years. And in 89, I was fortunate enough to get accepted to MIT. So I packed my 2 bags with all my worldly possessions, kissed my mom goodbye, and went off to Boston sight unseen. First time ever being there. And the time I spent, the 6 years that I spent at MIT, was a incredible experience. It literally changed the shape of my personal curve. I studied rocket science there, and when I graduated, really wanted to work in the industry, but couldn't find a job. At that point in time, I was still a foreign national, and it was difficult because of security clearances to work in the industry. So my advisor said, why don't you try management consulting? Because at that point in time, consultants were aggressively recruiting people with quantitative backgrounds. So I went down that path, got hired by BCG, and that's where I cut my teeth, really, in the New York office. And in short order, got transferred to Australia. So this is in the mid-90s, 95 or so, and that was my first tour of duty in Australia at the time. Back then, we were working on an engagement with Qantas that just purchased Australian Airlines, and we were helping them figure out how to bring the two organizations together and do all of the things that are involved in post-merger integration work. So that was fun. And then shortly after that, had an opportunity to join the founding team of a startup airline in London. Very different than anything else I'd done before. But it was an opportunity that I couldn't say no to. And it was an incredible ride. I was there for the first just under 2 years. And at this point in time, British Airways wanted to get into the low-cost airline market and gave us £25 million and said, you've got 6 months to start an airline, go. And pun intended, the name of the airline was Go. And it was an incredible ride. And it's very different than a technology startup. This is starting an airline, so now you've got physical assets, you're bringing on aircraft, you're bringing on loads of people with every aircraft, you've got safety concerns and so forth. It's circa 1998. The internet was still an unknown entity. So my responsibilities back then were a couple of different things. I was involved in, when you're early stage, you do multiple things at the same time. So I was involved in a lot of the analysis around our route strategy, our pricing models, etc. But then I also got involved in rolling out our online booking engine, which at the time was groundbreaking and really challenging because A, it was a new concept. B, culturally, it was very different to what people in Italy or Rome or Spain were comfortable with. So we had to figure out how do you change behavior? How do you move people from the traditional channels to what can be a low-cost channel? And then I also got involved in putting together some of our revenue-generating relationships beyond the ticket sales. So things like car rentals, hotels, travel insurance and so forth. So that was a terrific ride. I left that and had an itch to scratch. I wanted to do two things. Wanted to find my way back to America. This was around 1999 where the dot-com boom was at a fever pitch. And I also wanted to go to business school because that was something from a younger age that I wanted to, a journey I also wanted to go on. So I went back to Harvard Business School, graduated, and joined a technology startup called Empirics. And the way I got to this startup was quite interesting. I had a mentor at the time. And graduating from HBS, I had three opportunities. One with an incubator, two with a young startup, technology startup that was going to change the world in web services. And then the third was with another small technology company. So I was agonizing which direction I should go. I sat with my mentor and he said, you know what, I don't like any of these. I think they're not going to make it. And he had very thoughtful reasons why. And then he said, but I'm doing a startup and you should come help me with that. He was a founder of a pretty significant business in Boston called Teradyne, which does semiconductor testing. And he was going to get some venture money and carve out some assets from that business and package it like a startup. So it's fundamentally a startup in drag. And that was around 2000, and I joined that leadership team, took on product management, product marketing roles, and we rode that business for about 8 years. Very turbulent times. So if you think back between 2000, I joined in June of that year. The GFC hit in about September of that year. And it actually was more aggressive in the markets that we were playing in. So we were playing in voice over IP, telecommunications. The bottom literally fell out of those markets. So we had to figure out how do you navigate these turbulent waters and still stay viable. Fortunately, towards 2008, we were able to sell a third of that business to Oracle. I was running sales at the time, and then came over to Oracle, took over running the enterprise manager business for North America for a couple of years. And then my Australian wife said, I've had enough of the winters. We need to find our way back to Melbourne. So came over.
And it's 4 degrees outside.
And it's 4 degrees outside, and she's shoveling snow off of the car, and her friends in Melbourne are on the beach. So that was not very helpful. But came over with Oracle, ran the engineered systems business here for 2 years. And then Salesforce came knocking. And I looked at what Salesforce was doing at the time and said this was an incredible journey to be part of, and came over at Salesforce, and here I am. So that's the Reader's Digest version.
You've had such an incredible couple of years in your career so far, but I wanted to actually go back a little bit earlier, just because of my huge passion with cricket.
Oh,
and
sure.
So when we last caught up, you were mentioning that that was in high school. You were playing with Brian Lara.
That's right. So when in my youth, I had two goals. And someone asked me this question recently, and on reflecting, I realized that in my high school years is probably when I was most focused. And maybe you can say, well, back then you didn't have the internet to distract you, and we didn't live interrupt-driven lives as we do today. But my two goals was, one was to win a national scholarship, So I was academically focused. And the other was to play for the national Trinidad under-19 team. So I used to put a lot of energy and effort into my cricket, almost like those 10,000 hours that Malcolm Gladwell speaks about. And as it turns out, Brian was a classmate. So we played on multiple teams together representing our high school. But then we went through the system together as well at the regional level and then finally on the national level. And then we played 1 year. I played for Trinidad twice. Brian played once because he, after distinguishing himself, went on to the West Indies. And we've gone in two very different career journeys, but we've remained friends. He comes to Australia regularly every year, and he's a keen golfer now, as am I. He's a much better golfer than I am, if I'm being truthful. But we've remained in touch. And what's really fun is now my 10-year-old son, even though he was born in America, in Boston, has developed a very strong passion for cricket. And he's already declared that he will, not wants to, but will break Brian's batting record. So we send Brian some of his videos in the nets, and he gets a few tips from the master himself.
Brian Lara is a huge hero of mine, but it's interesting that you mentioned the focus in high school. So I had a very similar story with cricket as well. Like growing up, there's like photos of me from pretty much when I could walk that I had a cricket bat in my hand, Indian background, obviously. Mm-hmm. And what you kind of just mentioned about focus was exactly the same thing for me. I wanted to play cricket professionally, and every single day I was, coming home and practicing. But similar to what you sort of mentioned with MIT as well, and your sort of dream of playing that, even though you spent all of those hours and had all of that focus in one thing, that didn't pan out. What was that sort of like for you from going, this is something that I really wanted, from, wanting to pursue a career in the aeronautical industry. What was that like when you knew that wouldn't work out and that you then had to pivot in terms of your career and future goals?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And I think part of what you learn is appreciating the journey as opposed to the destination. Now, I can say that now. I know back then in 95 when I was ready to graduate and you've got all of these aspirations, desires, ambitions. And for a moment there, you realize that they're not going to play out the way you expected. So it is a body blow. And it requires a certain amount of resilience to get back up, redirect, and forge ahead. And it's one of the things I think about a lot as a parent, right? One of the things I do here now in Melbourne to stay connected with MIT is I interview prospective students. And we've been in Melbourne now for 5 years, and we used to live for 14 years, we being my wife and my young family, in Boston. So I used to stay very close to the university. So when we were packing up and coming over, I met with the Dean of Admissions and said, I'm going to be interviewing students in Australia. I'm sure I'm going to get asked, what is MIT looking for? Can you share with me what are the criteria? And he said, it probably comes down to three things. We're looking for resilience, we're looking for intellectual curiosity, and we're looking for excellence. And those three things have stayed with me, both in terms of values for my own personal career, but also values that I want to instill in my own children as a parent. And I think if you can get those three things right, everything else should take care of itself. And we can spend time on each of those. Resilience, the ability to get back up, the ability to handle adversity and learn from the challenges and not view it as failure. Something that's being talked about consistently now in the local ecosystem. And it's unclear, how do you actually teach resilience? How do you solve for resilience? But there's no question, you can't argue, that it's a vital ingredient. Intellectual curiosity, that's the growth mindset that says you have this beginner's mind. You as a parent, I marvel at how many times my young son or daughter would ask, why, about fundamental questions. And it forces you to think through the answers. Because it's very easy as a parent to say, because I said so. And it's very easy as a professional to say, that's the way it always is. But a growth mindset says, why is that? And can there be a better way? You know, children always say, what if we did this? And I think every child starts off their journey with a boatload of creativity and a boatload of curiosity, and somehow we lose that along the way. So that's where the beginner's mind, intellectual curiosity is equally vitally important. And then the third one is around excellence. It's back to that focus. Do you have things that you're passionate about, that you're willing to invest your time to develop a certain level of mastery? You're willing to put in those hours. You're willing to focus on acquiring those skills that can and should pay dividends along the way.
Focusing on resilience, as you mentioned, that's such an important factor for startups, especially. You face, constant barriers, you face constant criticism and people not believing in you, and both internal and external demons when it comes to sort of getting a venture off the ground. Was that something for you that was ingrained, or was that just something that you had growing up, or was that something that you kind of developed over time? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question as well, and I think so. I grew up under very modest conditions. And some people will say we were poor, and I think what you can look at that and go, well, that's my lot. Or you can look at that and say, I'm going to find a way to break out and through. And I had the latter point of view. And I think that was part of my internal drive and fuel. And it's interesting because academically, I was pretty strong. I was the top of my class, relatively small, graduated high school class of about 150 students. And then you get to MIT, and you're thinking, you got a little bit of bravado. You're like, okay, I'm top of the class. And you meet a bunch of 1,000 other incredibly capable, if not much more talented than yourself people. And that's a wake-up call. And that's when that's when I learned the value of what's being talked about now, of cognitive diversity. Because you bump into a bunch of people that have dramatically different life stories, that come from multiple parts of the world, that have mastery in domains that you didn't even know that existed. And you can respond to that one of two ways. You can go, well, I certainly don't belong here. Or you can say, you know what, I'm gonna shoulder up. I'm gonna lean in. I'm gonna do the work to learn from this peer group, but also rise to the occasion. And I think in doing that builds resilience as well. So resilience is a muscle. And one of the things you learn in any physical activity is if you don't train a muscle, it atrophies, right? So you don't get to a point where you go, I've lifted so many weights that now I've got the physique that I want. I can just put everything to rest. Because guess what? You're going to wake up one day and realize that you have lost your tone and you've lost your strength and you've lost the shape. So it's the same with resilience. I think you got to find ways to continually test your resilience, your resolve, your ability to handle adversity. So there are simple drills you can do where I sometimes do it myself. You go to a restaurant, you've got a beautiful meal, you decide you're going to eat half and leave it. And not that you want to waste money, but you want to build that temperament where you can handle tough situations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. On that, is that something, you mentioned MIT obviously looks for that, but is that something that you look for, and how do you test that in other people?
Yeah, I certainly look for it. And when I've hired a bunch of people in the past, I've had the not so pleasant situations of letting people go as well. So when I hire people, I tend to look at those three criteria as well. Does this person have resilience? Are they intellectually curious? And do they have demonstrated excellence? And typically the excellence you're looking for is along the lines of the roles that you're hiring for. Resilience is a tough one. And there's where storytelling is important, where you ask questions. I always start with a question. Give me a scenario where you didn't succeed or you failed. Talk me through, and let's drill in that in detail. So it's not just a superficial story. And let's understand what led to that and what you did after. And can you demonstrate that you've taken the learnings from that situation and applied it to the point where you can now tell another story of how that has led to a much better outcome. So those are the kinds of things that you'd want to discuss. Hand in hand with resilience is conflict. Oftentimes, body blows come from not physical challenges, but interpersonal challenges. This is something that I think startups will face. You have a small team. There's conflict in the founder dynamic. How do you handle that? Do you take it head on, or do you ignore it? Do you try to avoid it? These are fundamental things that are going to determine whether or not the startup gets off the ground or whether or not it goes sideways.
Sure. One of the things that you touched on is something I'm extremely passionate about, storytelling. And I think, and again, we were kind of speaking about this before we turned on the microphone, but it's a skill that's really important to founders, but hasn't really been developed by that many founders. What are the components of a good storyteller to you?
Yeah, storytelling to me is a lost art. And I've been reflecting on this more intentionally in the last few years, but when I look back, I realized that I always loved a good story, and B, I enjoyed telling stories. And what you realize is it's similar to sales. It's misunderstood. So when I graduated from business school, and in the technology startup that I was part of, I ended up taking over sales. My classmates would be, "You're in sales? Why are you doing sales?" And you think about it, that sales, if you cannot sell, then the viability of your business is fundamentally in question. And you think of it as a startup CEO, you are selling co-founders to come on the journey with you. You are selling investors to put money in. You're selling early stage customers to take the risk, which is really what it is in an early stage company, and go on the journey with you. You are selling, when you go public, investors to invest in your stock as opposed to someone else's. So the selling process is vitally important throughout the life of a company. And when you think in your personal life, equally so, you're selling a potential spouse, you're selling friends. And as part of that selling process, I think storytelling is the fundamental ingredient, which is, how do you inspire people? How do you communicate ideas? I'm reading a book right now by Tom Hicks, I think his name is. And it's a historical reflection on the similarities between Churchill and Orwell. And what you realize about those two historical figures is the ability to tell stories. One told stories through a political lens, and the other told stories through through writing books and literature. But at the end, they were able to have a dramatic impact on the world as we appreciate it today, coming through World War II and pushing back on the forces that were threatening democracy as we understand it today. But they had to inspire nations to take up arms and go to battle. And fundamentally, that's what you're trying to do when you're telling stories as a startup. You're building your ecosystem. You're building your nation. You're rallying. Every good action movie has a pivotal scene where the main protagonist tells a story to inspire the troops. So I think if you reflect on those stories, they typically have an arc, right? What is the vision? How we're going to get there? What does the end state look like? The other component about good storytelling, we talked about practice earlier, put it in the work, is you don't just wake up one day and become an amazing storyteller. It requires practice and relentless practice as well. It's almost like being a musician, right? If you think about it, musicians are telling stories through their music. When they put on a concert, they are communicating to you in a really dramatic way. But what you don't realize is the amount of work, effort, preparation that goes into that story. And if you think about someone, just pick your favorite artist, whether it's Madonna or Beyonce or whoever else, after every show, they take copious notes and figure out how to get better. Even though the next show is the exact same story, but how do I make it better? So in my role now, I tell a lot of stories. I tell stories to the startup ecosystem. I tell stories to the larger part of town about how they can transform their businesses on our platform. And one of the things I always do is I ask for feedback. I ask for genuine feedback. I say, tell me what you think. You don't have to tell me now. You can send notes later. But I would love to understand how this resonated and how we can make it better.
Just one thing that I would add to the storytelling bit as well is that yes, it's about having a good story, but you have to understand who you're telling the story for. And so, especially for startup founders, you mentioned bringing on co-founders, bringing on investors, or bringing on customers. You need to tell an effective story, but that story will be very different for the different groups.
That's right.
So understanding who your audience is critical to that story being effective, not just having a good story.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And that then highlights a couple of other components that's important in storytelling, which is empathy and the elusive EQ, emotional intelligence, right? And what you find is storytellers that are incredible are the ones that have those two things. The empathy and emotional intelligence, you can argue they're fundamentally the same thing. But what it is it gives you the ability to read the audience. So it's almost like being a jazz musician. You can figure out, okay, I need to go with this note instead, just based on the feedback and the emotions you're getting back from the room, whether that's a one-on-one conversation or a one-on-many conversation. Not thinking I need to get through these lines, but I'm telling a story, and the story tunes and riffs based on feedback and what you're getting back from the person on the other side.
Exactly. I mean, looking at sales specifically as an example, it's not just about getting through the sales pitch. It's about understanding what's the person on the other side looking for.
Exactly.
And how does your product or service sort of fit into that?
That's right.
So one other thing that I have to touch on with your background was how do you launch a new airline in 6 months? How does that happen?
With a lot of stress. Well, look, it's fortunately we had people who knew what they were doing. So the way it was structured was BA decided, British Airways, that they're going to create this startup airline as a wholly owned subsidiary. So there'll be the only formal relationship would be through ownership, but we were fully empowered to create a new entity. And that was dramatically different back then because within the airline industry, low-cost carriers were highly disruptive. They were tantamount to Uber, what Uber is doing today in the transportation and taxi industry. So there was a lot of panic, and people were experimenting with different models, and they weren't really being successful because either A, they were trying to have an airline within an airline and moving assets and people around, and that has all its complicated factors. So the BA's approach proved to be pretty enlightened. But we had our CEO at the time was running BA's North American operations. So she knew it's hard to start an airline if you don't know how an airline runs and works and operations. We took one of their senior pilots who was looking for a new challenge, and he became our chief pilot, which is a person who's responsible for the maintenance, the crew, the onboarding of the pilots, and so forth, things that require deep domain expertise and skill. And then we had a guy by the name of Dominic Paul, who's become a life friend, who is the closest thing, a mashup between the Ethan Hunt character on Mission Impossible and Jason Bourne. He's an adrenaline junkie. He now runs Costa Coffee, so his career has taken off. But he still races cars. He still does triathlons and so forth. And he was, in any startup, you talk about a hipster, hustler, hacker. He was a hustler. He was there. He put himself on the map at BA, where BA wanted to break into Russia. And they said, we're going to parachute you in. And 6 months from now, a 747 is going to be landing in Russia. Be ready. And he figured out how to get it done. So bringing these 5 people together created a really good team dynamic. And if you think back to any founding team, it's what are the skills you need, and being authentic on where the gaps are. Particularly if you're the CEO, knowing where are my gaps and what do I need to do to have the core capabilities around me. So Barbara, our CEO, is the visionary. She could communicate. She can tell great stories. But she needed a Dominic, someone that can get stuff done and can have incredible attention to detail and so forth. The other thing that you realize about an airline is it scales dramatically in a very short period of time. So every aircraft drags along hundreds of people with it, with cabin crew, ground maintenance, customer service agents, etc. So the growth was dramatic in terms of people, in terms of assets, in terms of potential revenue and so forth. It was a terrific ride.
One of the things that you touched on was you can't launch an airline without knowing how an airline works. And I think one of the things that happens a lot in the startup space is, again, there's no shortage of really good ideas, but people potentially not having the domain expertise or the right sort of team around them. How important is it for you? How important do you think it is to have, A, the right team members, and B, be in a position where you can actually take advantage of that idea? Because one of the biggest lessons that I've learned from the podcast and through my own ventures is, again, no shortage of good ideas. The question is, are you the right person to execute on this particular idea and take advantage and make it successful?
That's exactly right. And I think that is vitally important. There are very few unique ideas out there. And in fact, I challenge every startup CEO who's early on their journey to just do the Google test. Just think about your idea and Google it, and you probably see that there are 5 to 500 other people out there doing. Now, that's not a reason to be despondent, because as we talked about earlier, it's the second mouse that gets the cheese in most cases. The first mouse shows the second mouse where the traps are. So it's not a question of can you find an original idea. Think about it. In the last 15 to 20 years, the NDA has gone away, right? So I remember back in the 90s, someone would want to talk to you about your idea and they say, can you sign this NDA before we talk? And you say, okay. Now, if someone says sign an NDA, you go, are you serious? Because it's not about the idea. It's about can you execute? And the ability to execute hinges on your core team, right? So that's where if you are doing a tech startup and you don't have a real strong, deep technology co-founder on your team, that's a red flag. When you think about investment decisions today, investors are fundamentally trying to answer two questions. One is this an exciting space that has the potential for large returns? And is this the team that can do it? Are they going to stay in the fight? Do they have the skills? Do they know what they're doing? And if the answer to those two questions is yes, then it's a no-brainer. If the answers to one of those questions is yes, then it's requires more thought. If it's a really exciting opportunity with dramatic potential, but there are question marks on the team, then it's okay, how can we improve the team, etc. If it's not an exciting space and the team is really green, then that's obviously a no.
Again, on one of the things that you mentioned was, I think the word, it's not about the idea, it's about the execution, gets thrown around a lot. And I think a lot of the confusion comes from, execution means, can I launch this? But it's not, again, about launch, it's about, can you make it successful, and can
Correct.
you make it cut through all of the other noise? As you mentioned, there's somewhere between 5 to 100 other people working on the same idea around the world. Can you be the one of the few companies to go on and make that successful? One of the other things that, when we spoke in an early conversation, that really got me thinking was having an ecosystem strategy. Do you want to share a little bit about what that means and why startups should be thinking about that?
Sure. And it's something that I am quite passionate about, and marvel at how many startup founders today that I talk to have not thought through. And if you think about it, if you look at most, if not all, successful tech businesses today, and successful, when I say successful, I'm not talking about have you started your business and you've gotten to Series B, but have you been growing dramatically for five to 10 years, and have you gone public, and have you employed thousands of people, etc. When you look at those, the Googles, the Facebooks, we all know who they are, the Salesforces, what you realize is common in all of them, they've got a thriving ecosystem. A thriving ecosystem of partners, of customers, of systems integrators, of technology companies that are integrating, building on, etc. Why is that important? Because that provides velocity and momentum. So the challenge for every technology startup today, particularly in Australia, where you have the tyranny of distance, is what's your ecosystem strategy? And you don't have to be part of every ecosystem out there. And it's incredibly hard to build your own ecosystem when you're an early stage startup. So what's your strategy to be part of someone else's ecosystem, whether it's Salesforce, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Google, whether it's Facebook, whoever else? And that answering that question will obviously depend on what it is you're building. But you ask yourself, what's the value of being part of someone else's ecosystem? Well, you get strategic investment, you get access to customers, you get global reach, you get access to experts, because many of these large tech businesses have hundreds of developers developing complementary capabilities to what you're doing. So the question is, how can you tell a story that says to any of these large technology companies, here's the value that our business brings to your customers? And I think that's important, because oftentimes startup founders view it in the inverse. They view it that the large tech companies should figure that out. And if you stop and think for it for a while, there's so much. The large tech companies are now at cruising altitude. So they're worried about different things. And whilst, at Salesforce, we're passionate about helping the local ecosystem thrive and grow, but we don't have the cycles to look at every startup and figure out how they complement our business. So the ones that get strong tractions are the ones that reach out and say, hey, knowing what we know, here's the way we think we can add value to your customers. And if that has merit, then we lean in and we figure out how to bring them to our customers. And if you think about that, now you have the opportunity to sell your capabilities to hundreds of thousands of customers around the world, that's where the magic happens.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I think that, again, goes back to knowing your audience and knowing what they value. So one of the things that startups are always looking for is, how can I access Salesforce's, client base, or how can I sort of get into that, versus someone coming to you and saying, here's how we benefit your user base and here's the value that you get from working with us. It's a completely different situation. So is there a particular stage or time or cycle within a startup where it makes most sense to have an ecosystem strategy in place?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the counterpoint is a large tech company can suck the life out of a startup. Let's just be clear. It can. So if you engage too early, you can get pulled into a vortex. You can get pulled into a black hole. And I tell startups this when I say, guys, it's too early. Because while directionally it's kind of interesting, either you don't have the muscle yet. So if we were to put you into the machine, you'd probably get sucked in. And more importantly, there's a credibility challenge where if we put you in front of a customer, can you deliver? And there's a very different expectation and requirement when that happens. So you got to ask yourself, are we ready for that? Are we 0 stage? Are we early stage? Are we in growth stage? I think the being part of an ecosystem is most valuable when you're in growth stage, where you figured out your model, where you are really clear on product market fit. That way you can tell a story about what it is your Gesundheit does and how it has impact. But more importantly, you can execute and you can deliver. Because when we put you in front of a customer, that's vitally important. That they say, yeah, this startup is really exciting. We like their capabilities. Let's run a trial. Can you actually deliver on that? Whether they're in Australia or global or so forth, do you have those capabilities? So that's why I think it's pretty important. The other thing that I think is also important is, startups are out there raising money. You should have a strong, thought out thesis on what your fundraising strategy is. If you look on the other side of the table, the people that are investing in you have a thesis. Whether it's a early stage venture capital, later stage venture capital, or a strategic corporate venture like ourselves. So you should have a thesis, and it's a bi-directional interview that's going on, just like the dating that goes on before marriage, because it is a marriage. You are entering into this relationship potentially for 5 to 7 years. And so in thinking about the thesis, I encourage startups to think about 3 fundamental things. One is, what's your strategy? 2 is, what stage are you in? And then 3 is, what are your fundamental needs? So what your strategy can say, we want to be part of this particular ecosystem for whatever reasons they are. So as a result, we're going to court these strategic investors. What your stage is says, are we early stage, mid stage, growth stage? Because that will rule in and out different types of investors. For us at Salesforce, we typically just look at later stage, Series A and above companies. So if you're raising seed money, you should know that having a conversation with us is premature. We would still love to talk to you, because the other dimension is, to an investor, you want to look like a line, not a dot. A dot says you're ready to raise money and you are talking to that potential investor for the first time. So they really don't have a relationship. A line says, even though now you're having a conversation about raising money, you have had conversations before. So there's a relationship there. There's a story. There's a trajectory. There's momentum. The second, so strategy, stage, and then the third bit is what are your fundamental needs? Are you just after cash to fuel your growth? Are you after a Rolodex? that can introduce you to talent that you want to bring into the business, but also open doors in terms of customers? Are you after access to developers and skills and so forth? And I think if you answer those three questions, it will form a thesis about who are the right investment partners for you to be spending time with.
Absolutely. In terms of ecosystems, what are your views on the Australian startup ecosystem?
Look, I think I'm incredibly bullish on the Australian startup ecosystem for a couple of reasons. One is, we talked earlier that my wife and I, were thinking of moving to Australia probably around 2008. And we ended up moving in the end of 2011. And I started looking at the Australian ecosystem at that time. And the simplest way to describe it is it's dramatically different from then to now. And you've probably heard me use this analogy before, leaning on my aeronautical background. It feels a lot like being in a giant 747. And the reason why I think that analogy is so powerful and why I continue to use it is that everyone should be able to empathize with that. When you get into an aircraft, it doesn't have to be a 747. As soon as that aircraft takes off and gets to cruising altitude, everyone gets distracted. They turn on the movie, they read their book, they play Sudoku or Tetris or whatever else, and they lose the ability to perceive two fundamental things. One is the speed at which the aircraft is moving. Sometimes it's 700 k's per hour. And the fact that the aircraft is actually turning and maneuvering and changing course. And then the captain comes on and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to arrive in Sydney." And you go, "Really? How did that happen?" And I think you're seeing a little bit of that dynamic here in the local ecosystem. We have very much a half-empty perspective on it, where we need to do more of this. There's not enough action from the government. So many things need to be fixed. I challenge the ecosystem. I challenge everyone to take a half-full perspective on it, to put the Sudoku magazine down and look out the window and realize that we're actually changing. The amount of venture capital that's come into this space in the last 5 years is significant. Granted, we still have a long way to go to catch up with North America and Israel, but relative to where we were 5 years ago, you're seeing more startup founders, you're seeing more businesses, you're seeing more co-working spaces, you're seeing more celebrations of the ecosystem. Just this week, we had Melbourne Accelerator Program have 800 people celebrating in grand affair the local startup ecosystem. I think that's magnificent. So I'm bullish that the Australian ecosystem will become one of the hotbeds of Asia Pacific, and I think we just need to be a little bit more bullish on it.
Sure. And in terms of Salesforce, how does Salesforce fit into the Australian startup ecosystem, and how does your role sort of specifically fit in?
Sure. So we were a startup 18 years ago. People forget that. In 1999, our CEO, Mark Benioff, had this vision. He said, "I'm going to make enterprise software as easy to use as buying a book on Amazon." And he marched up and down Silicon Valley with that idea. And one of the true tests of disruption is when most people think you're crazy. But Mark is one of those true Silicon Valley visionaries, and he endured and he pushed forward and fundamentally changed the world. Ushered in enterprise cloud computing as we understand it today as a mainstream idea and concept and capability. Also brought to the market software as a service as a commercial model, pay as you go. Again, mainstream ideas now 18 years in. So we believe now that we have become one of the fourth largest software companies on the planet, that we have an obligation to send the elevator back down. Particularly here in Australia, where the ecosystem is developing. So one of the things, so we do a number of things to help with that. We've got a corporate venture fund. where we look for interesting software as a service companies that complement what we do, that have demonstrated traction and success and looking to go faster. So we've got probably about close to 200 companies across 14 countries now. And we are in early stages here in Australia looking to identify companies that we're excited about and that we can partner with. Then we've got programs to help startups build their business on the Salesforce platform from a technology stack standpoint, or to accelerate their business and scale using our solutions. There's a lot being discussed right now around how do we help companies scale. Scale up is a new term that everyone's bantering around. We focus on that consistently. And for us, scale comes down to three fundamental things. One is customers. No startup went out of business because they didn't have enough money. They went out of business because they didn't have enough customers. If you continue to attract and retain customers, good things continue to happen, right? It's a fundamental ingredient for success. So how do you develop the rhythm to be a customer-centric organization to attract and retain customers? We can spend an entire podcast on that. The second is around capacity. How do you, particularly as an early stage company that's entering into growth, how do you build the capacity to handle those customers and to handle that growth? It's a little bit like being going from a child to an adolescent. You know, you get a little bit uncoordinated, and now parts of your body is growing faster than other parts, but you want to have that capacity. One of the great things about the times today in which we operate, a lot of that capacity comes from technology. It creates productivity capabilities within your organization, whether it is the capacity to attract more customers through automated marketing capabilities, whether it's the capacity to sell to those customers in a more programmatic way using Salesforce automation, whether it's the capacity to service those customers and deliver delightful outcomes so that they stay with you if you are as a service business. So you can look to technology more to add that capacity to the business. And then the third one, which has to be there, is cash, right? You run out of cash, you shut the doors. So customers, capacity, cash, we think those are the three things that are important. And that's what we focus on in terms of inspiring the local ecosystem. How do you become a customer-centric company? How do you use technologies like Salesforce to build capacity into your business? And then through our corporate venture capabilities, how do you get the larger checks to fuel your growth?
I'm sure there's no shortage of companies that want to work with you or partner with Salesforce. What is it that you specifically look for in those companies? As you mentioned, you're in those sort of early stages of identifying companies now. What are the key ingredients that you're...
So we look at a couple of different things. One is there a complementary use case to what we do? So those of you that are listening that are not familiar exactly with what Salesforce does, fundamentally, Salesforce is a platform that manages all of your customer interactions. So that could be if you think about the life cycle of a customer, you start off when they are not yet customers and you want to market to them. So there are activities that you want to do either through social campaigns or electronic digital campaigns. That's all within the marketing interaction. So we've got capabilities that can do that, Marketing Cloud. And then you bring them on board and you want to sell to them, and you want to sell to them effectively, and you want to manage your sales teams and manage quotas and opportunities and leads and contacts. And that's all within our sales interaction, the Sales Cloud. And then you want to service those customers. You want to either through online or contact centers and so forth. So that's a service interaction. So sales, service, marketing, communities, apps, and so forth, all on the same platform. So we look for companies that complement those use cases. Either they're doing interesting things that can enrich a service delivery. So for example, right now there's a lot of energy and effort being spent by organizations here in Australia and globally on how do you improve the customer experience, because that's now the new frontier. Customer experience is being defined and driven by brands that did not exist 5 to 10 years ago. Uber, Airbnb, Lyft, Amazon, etc. So the incumbents are trying to figure out how do we react. So capabilities that allow you to deliver omni-channel experiences, mobile-first experiences, intelligent experiences, now that you can do things like service deflection using autonomous bots and so forth. So we always pay attention to companies that are doing all of these kinds of things and always ask the question, is there an integrated use case with Salesforce? So the extent to which they can come with a prepared point of view is really helpful. We also look for companies that are in interesting technology categories that we care about. So mobility is pretty important to us. We think the world has already transcended mobility. If you don't have a mobile-first native strategy, then you got to ask yourself, what are you doing? So next generation mobile capabilities is always interesting. Employee productivity is pretty important to us. The next wave, we're moving into the fourth industrial revolution right now. And a big question out there is, how do we restore productivity? In the previous industrial revolutions, productivity came through the mechanization of processes, production lines, through the steam engine and electricity. The productivity gains around digital did not deliver to the extent that people expected. So some of the things that we're working on is how do you add productivity to white collar jobs through giving everyone a personal assistant, through digital aids, digital sales aids, through recommendation engines, and all of the things that we're now beginning to take for granted in our personal lives. How do you bring those to our professional lives? One fun thing that I love to share is the fact that we have come full circle. So when I started my career in the 90s, the cool tech was in the workplace, right? You rushed to work. I was a consultant back then. You had a mobile phone that was the size of my arm. You had a dot matrix printer. You had voicemail. You had a desktop. You wanted to be in the office because that's where the cool stuff was. Now, the cool tech is in your pocket. And you can run your personal lives from your phone. You can collaborate with friends and family. You can manage your finances. You can book transportation. Do you have that same experience now in your personal life, in your professional life? And if you stop and think, the answer is obviously, in the most cases, no. Can you run your professional role, whether you're a marketer or a salesperson or a developer, from your phone? If you go down the road for a coffee break and something happens in your customer service agent, do you have to rush back to the office, or can you handle it on your phone? Right? So those are the problems we're trying to solve. So startups that have a point of view and a capability in those areas, we want to talk to you. So intelligence is also a major category and emphasis for us right now. We think we're accelerating to a world where everything is becoming more connected and more intelligent. And those capabilities are going to allow you to look into the volume of data that's coming down the pipe right now and get the insight to deliver inspired experiences to customers.
Fantastic. I think one of the things that you touched on was just how the way that we interact with technologies continue to innovate over time. And obviously Salesforce is recognized as being one of the most innovative companies in the world. How does the organization, as large as it is, continue to innovate?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. And I think if you think back to the beginning, the founding principles of the business really set up the mindset. So back then, making software available as a service created this new model of interactions between customers and ourselves, where there's now a joint and aligned objective around success. Because if our customers aren't successful, guess what? We're not successful. And what I love to tell people is, think of the relationship that you have with the apps on your phone. So you probably have a few, if you're like me, I've got a few hundred apps on there distributed across multiple pages. The ones that you get most value at, they're on the first page and they're probably on the top line. And the ones that diminish in value get moved to the third and fourth page. And then when you're sitting offline on an aircraft at 30,000 feet, what do? You delete those ads, you prune through. And you're making an intrinsic value assessment at that point in time. So the challenge for us is to continually find ways to deliver value to our customers so that they're successful, and that will fuel our growth and our success. And we do that in a couple of different ways. One is we deliver 3 major releases a year. And that's like a train going down the tracks. That fundamentally turned the enterprise software model on its head. So I used to work for larger enterprise software companies in my previous lives, and it would be years between releases. And those releases will be unknown. So there was an innovation gap between what the market was running at, the level of innovation that the customers were running at in the market, and the level of innovation that the company believed that you should have through the current available version. When a customer called in, the first question you'd ask is, what version are you running on? And therein was the challenge, right? There's a gap between what version 8 in the market, and version 6 that the customers are running on. In a as-a-service model, that gap has been closed. You never have to ask that question. Every customer is running on the currently available version. And it's the same sort of paradigm with auto upgrades on your iPhone. You dip into a new app and suddenly you see all of these features and you go, wow, this is amazing, this is great. So it's that same paradigm. But then the challenge is, how do you create the empathy and the conversations with your customers so you understand what are the key features that should be part of each of those 3 major releases every year. So we do that through things like crowdsourcing our requirements from our hundreds of thousands of customers around the world in a gamified way, where they can go in and vote on those, and then you get a Pareto of features, and our product managers can go in and then figure out which of the features they're going to retire for the most points. So it's fun, but it's also aligned with strong customer value.
Fantastic. On that note, Robert, thanks so much for your time today and for sharing your experience and insights. For anyone that wants to say hello, get in touch, find out more, what's the best way for them to do that?
Follow me on Twitter. You can find me on Wickham. Or I tend to tweet out on these topics a lot. It's a great way to get inside my head. And then you can send me an email at rwickham@salesforce.com. Love to talk to you.
Perfect. I'll make sure those links are in the show notes. Once again, Robert, thanks so much for your time today.
Enjoyed it. Great to be here.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to episode 62 of the Startup Playbook podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Robert, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. A quick reminder to register for the live podcast with Kate Morris from Adore Beauty. I'll add the link to the registration page in the show notes for you. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at episode 63 next week.